At exactly 6:03 on a foggy Tuesday morning, I walked out onto my back porch wearing plaid boxers, a bathrobe, and a pair of steel-toed boots. In one hand, I held a thermos of hot black coffee, and in the other, my grandfather's old Winchester Model 70 rifle. At the far edge of my wooded property, 3 men in bright safety vests froze mid-swing with their stakes, staring at me as I called out in a polite but firm voice, "Gentlemen, you're standing about 43 feet past my property line. Would you like to explain yourselves before I call the sheriff, or maybe a taxidermist?" One of them actually trembled, and I'm fairly sure he lost control of himself a little. My name is Robert Sullivan. I moved to Maple Ridge Estates 3 years ago, looking for quiet and space. I'm a semi-retired structural engineer who spends most of his free time fishing or woodworking in the cedar-sided house I bought near the creek. The land came with 5 acres of trees, a crystal-clear stream, and unfortunately, the baggage of belonging to the Neighborhood Homeowners Association. The head of that organization was none other than Margaret Thornfield, self-appointed guardian of suburban order. With her flawless silver bob, a clipboard practically glued to her hip, and a custom golf cart she called the Enforcer, she patrolled the neighborhood with the energy of a prison warden. She loathed 3 things in particular: unapproved yard decorations, paint colors that strayed from the official palette, and, more than anyone else, me. Our battle began when I declined her invitation to the HOA book club, which, I later learned, was less about literature and more about gossip over trashy novels. Things really went downhill after I planted a Japanese maple 17 inches outside what she called an approved foliage radius. Until her notice arrived, I didn't even know such a rule existed. From then on, I was her prime target. The violation letters rolled in weekly, each one more ridiculous than the last. Trash bins left in view for 7 minutes instead of 6, wind chimes producing an unapproved tone, and even accusations that I had installed hidden speakers to mimic owl calls after sunset. I kept every letter in a folder marked comedy gold. But Margaret wasn't satisfied with just paper harassment. She mounted a security camera on a pole aimed directly into my yard, and when that yielded nothing, she escalated again, this time by hiring a surveying crew. She claimed it was to reassess property lines for a future gazebo project, but I knew her real aim was to carve a slice of my land into HOA property. That morning, I found fresh tire marks scarring my mulch beds, pink flags sticking out my herb garden, and men in hard hats setting up tripods squarely on my land. So I grabbed my coffee, threw on my robe, and picked up the rifle, not because I intended to fire it, but because sometimes a little visual emphasis gets the point across better than words. I approached with steady steps, keeping the rifle pointed down, but visible. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said evenly. "I'm Robert Sullivan, and you're trespassing." The lead surveyor, a shaky man with a clipboard, muttered something about special authorization from the HOA. When I asked to see it, he handed me a sheet of paper printed in Comic Sans with Margaret's purple gel pen signature at the bottom. "This is adorable," I told him, "but it's also completely fake. The HOA doesn't have the power to grant access to private property without the owner's consent. Now, I'll give you 5 minutes to clear out, or I'll be calling the real authorities." The man tried to argue, insisting Margaret had assured him everything was legal. That's when I shifted the rifle to my other hand, still down but unmistakably present. "Let me make this simple," I said calmly. "You're trespassing. That's a crime. Doing it with falsified documents, that's worse." One of the younger crew members leaned toward his boss and whispered something about lawsuits and liability. The lead surveyor's face drained of color as reality caught up to him. "We don't want any trouble," he said quickly, raising his hand slightly. "Mrs. Thornfield told us she had permission. If there's been a mistake, we'll leave right now." "A mistake?" I repeated, smiling faintly. "That's one way to describe fraud and criminal trespassing. But you're right about one thing: you should leave." As they scrambled to pack up their gear, I took out my phone and dialed the sheriff's department. "Yes, I'd like to report a trespassing situation at 847 Woodland Drive. 3 men claiming to be surveyors are on my land with forged paperwork." "Yes, I'll wait here for a deputy." "Thank you." The moment I ended the call, the crew nearly tripped over each other in their rush to pack up their gear. The leader, looking more nervous than ever, approached me one last time and spoke quietly. "Sir, we honestly didn't know the paperwork was fake. Mrs. Thornfield has hired us before for real HOA projects." "Interesting," I replied evenly. "I'm sure the sheriff will want to hear all about those jobs. You might consider giving a statement." Roughly 20 minutes later, 2 deputies pulled up. They reviewed the laughably forged document and took statements from everyone. When they ran IDs, they discovered that one of the surveyors had an outstanding warrant for 3 years of unpaid child support. He was handcuffed on the spot, while the other 2 were cited for trespassing. Deputy Martinez, someone I had met before at a community barbecue, pulled me aside. "Mr. Sullivan, this document is serious evidence. Has she pulled anything else like this before?" Without hesitation, I handed him my thick folder of HOA violation letters, the one I'd labeled Comedy Gold. He flipped through, whistling at the absurdity. "We'll need to open an investigation into her conduct as HOA president." What followed was a joint effort between the Sheriff's Department and the County Zoning Board. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. Margaret hadn't just bent rules. She'd been forging HOA paperwork for years, inventing violations, levying fake fines, and even siphoning money from association dues. The official HOA rules were simple: keep lawns tidy and avoid major disturbances. Everything else Margaret had enforced was her own invention. The zoning board also discovered something that nearly made me laugh out loud. 5 years earlier, the HOA had accidentally placed their ornamental fountain partly on my land. I technically owned 200 square feet of what they considered common space. A cease and desist order was issued at once, halting all HOA activity. Margaret's so-called executive privileges were revoked, and her prize golf cart, the enforcer, was impounded as evidence, since HOA funds had paid for it. The tow truck showed up during an emergency HOA meeting, and the look on her face as they hauled it away was unforgettable. 3 weeks later, the audit results were presented at a community-wide meeting, now held at the local center since Margaret was barred from HOA property. The acting president, a retired lawyer named Thomas Chin, read the findings aloud in a calm, professional tone that only made the revelation sting more. Over 5 years, Margaret had embezzled nearly $14,000, set up unauthorized surveillance, falsified documents, attempted fraudulent liens, and, in one of the most bizarre abuses, had even registered my cat, Mr. Whiskers, as a nuisance using forged complaints. The room erupted. Neighbors shouted, gasped, and cursed as they realized how deeply they'd been deceived. Margaret sat in the back, her complexion shifting from crimson to ghostly pale with each accusation. When the report was finished, Thomas called for a vote to permanently remove her from the board. Every hand in the room went up, even those of her former allies. Then came the final blow. The county prosecutor, who had quietly been listening in the front row, stood up, walked straight to her seat, and said, "Margaret Thornfield, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit trespassing." The deputy stepped forward, handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists. Her carefully crafted composure shattered. "This is absurd," she shrieked, her voice cracking into a shrill pitch. I was protecting property values. I was saving this neighborhood from people like him. She jabbed her cuffed hands toward me. "Do you know what he's done? He planted an unapproved tree." An unapproved tree. The prosecutor barely blinked. "Ma'am, you're facing up to 7 years in prison and more than $50,000 in fines. I'd recommend saving your arguments for your attorney." Her eyes widened. 7 years? 50,000? But I only took 14. Plus penalties. Plus restitution. Plus court costs. The prosecutor replied flatly. As they dragged her away, she turned one last time, her face twisted with rage. "This is your fault. You and your stupid rifle, and that illegal Japanese maple." I stood slowly, gave her a small wave, and said, "Actually, Margaret, you did this to yourself. And as for that maple, the county confirmed it's perfectly legal and beautiful. Enjoy prison." Her furious scream echoed through the community center as the deputies led her out.